June 4, 1942. 6,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Henderson gripped the stick of his Douglas Dauntless dive bomber so tightly his knuckles had turned white beneath his leather flight gloves. Below him stretched an endless expanse of blue water, shimmering under the tropical sun like hammered steel. The air was thin at this altitude, cold despite the equatorial latitude, and Henderson could feel his heart pounding against his ribs as he scanned the horizon for any sign of the enemy fleet that intelligence had promised would be there. His squadron, Bombing Squadron 8, flew in loose formation behind him. 17 aircraft carrying 17 crews who had trained for months for exactly this moment. They had launched from the deck of the USS Enterprise just 2 hours earlier. Their mission simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. Find the Japanese carrier strike force and sink it before it could do the same to them. What Henderson did not know, what none of them could have known, was that within the next 40 minutes, he would make a decision that his fellow pilots would later describe as either the bravest or the most reckless act they had ever witnessed. A decision that would fundamentally alter the course of the conflict in the Pacific and prove that sometimes the line between genius and madness is measured not in inches, but in altitude. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how one man's refusal to follow conventional tactics, his willingness to push his aircraft beyond every known limit, transformed what should have been a minor engagement into one of the most decisive moments of the entire Pacific theater. It is a story about the thin margin between heroism and disaster, and how the greatest victories are sometimes won by those willing to embrace what everyone else calls impossible. To understand what Henderson was about to attempt, we first need to understand the desperate situation facing American forces in the summer of 1942. 6 months earlier, the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had devastated the Pacific Fleet, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and claiming the lives of over 2,300 Americans in a single morning. The Japanese military had followed this stunning success with a rapid conquest of Southeast Asia, capturing the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and countless Pacific islands in what seemed like an unstoppable tide of expansion. By May of 1942, Japanese forces controlled a vast empire stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific, and their military planners were already looking toward their next objective: the total elimination of American naval power through the capture of Midway Atoll, a tiny coral island roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway was strategically vital because it served as an early warning outpost for the Hawaiian Islands themselves. If it fell, the Japanese would have a forward base from which to threaten Hawaii directly and potentially force the Americans to negotiate a peace settlement favorable to Tokyo. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, devised an elaborate plan to lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive engagement near Midway. He assembled the largest fleet Japan had ever sent to sea: 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, 13 cruisers, 45 destroyers, and numerous support vessels. The strike force alone, centered on the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented the most powerful concentration of naval aviation ever assembled. Against this armada, the Americans could muster only 3 carriers: the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown, the latter still bearing scars from a recent engagement in the Coral Sea and hastily repaired in just 72 hours at Pearl Harbor. American intelligence, however, had one crucial advantage. Codebreakers had partially cracked the Japanese naval cipher and knew not only that an attack on Midway was imminent, but approximately when and from what direction it would come. This intelligence gave Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, the opportunity to position his carriers northeast of Midway, hidden from Japanese reconnaissance, waiting to ambush the attackers. It was a tremendous gamble. If the intelligence was wrong, or if the Japanese discovered the American carriers first, the entire Pacific Fleet could be lost in a single afternoon. Lieutenant Commander Henderson had been flying dive bombers for almost 4 years by the time he found himself circling above the Pacific that June morning. Born in a small town in Nebraska in 1910, he had grown up during the Great Depression, watching his father struggle to keep the family farm solvent as crop prices collapsed and drought turned the prairie into a dust bowl. Aviation had been his escape, first as a barnstormer performing at county fairs, then as a naval aviator after he received his commission in 1936. By the standards of 1942, Henderson was practically an old man at 32, ancient compared to the fresh-faced ensigns who made up most of his squadron. But age had given him something that youth could not: thousands of hours of flight time, an intimate understanding of his aircraft's capabilities and limitations, and a reputation among his peers as someone who could coax performance from a Dauntless that the engineers at Douglas Aircraft Company would have sworn was impossible. His radioman and rear gunner, aviation radioman second-class Thomas Kowalski, had been flying with Henderson for almost 18 months. Kowalski was 23, a Polish-American from Chicago who had enlisted in the Navy to escape a dead-end job in a meatpacking plant. He trusted Henderson completely, a trust that would be tested beyond all reasonable limits before the day was over. The morning of June 4th had begun with the Japanese launching their first strike against Midway Island at 4:30 in the morning. 108 aircraft, a mix of bombers and fighters, swept over the tiny atoll, devastating its facilities but failing to eliminate the American aircraft based there, many of which had already taken off to attack the Japanese fleet. The Midway-based aircraft, a hodgepodge of obsolete torpedo bombers and Marine Corps dive bombers, pressed their attacks with extraordinary courage but achieved nothing except their own destruction. Wave after wave of American aircraft were shot out of the sky by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire, their torpedoes either missing or failing to detonate. By mid-morning, it seemed like the engagement was going exactly as Admiral Yamamoto had planned. The American carriers had been located by Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, and Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force, was preparing to launch a devastating attack that would eliminate the last significant American naval presence in the Pacific. His aircraft were being rearmed and refueled on the flight decks of all 4 carriers, their crews working with practiced efficiency to prepare for what everyone expected to be the killing blow. It was at this moment, 10:22 in the morning local time, that Henderson's squadron finally located the Japanese fleet. They had been searching for over an hour, their fuel tanks steadily draining, their nerves stretched to the breaking point by the knowledge that every minute in the air brought them closer to the point of no return. Several pilots had already suggested turning back, concerned that they would not have enough fuel to return to the Enterprise if they continued much longer. Henderson had refused. Something in his gut told him they were close, and he had learned long ago to trust his instincts. When the first mast tips appeared on the horizon, rising from the sea like the fingers of a drowning man, he felt a surge of adrenaline so intense it was almost painful. There they were, 4 carriers, surrounded by a ring of escorts, their flight decks covered with aircraft. What Henderson saw as he approached the Japanese fleet would have discouraged most pilots. The carriers were defended by dozens of fighters, the famous Mitsubishi aircraft that had proven themselves superior to almost everything the Americans could put in the air. Below the fighters, a wall of anti-aircraft fire was already reaching up toward the American aircraft, tracers drawing bright lines through the morning sky. And on the flight decks themselves, Henderson could see the crews scrambling, clearly aware that they were under attack and preparing to launch their own aircraft. Standard doctrine called for a coordinated attack. The dive bombers were supposed to wait for torpedo bombers to draw the enemy fighters down to sea level, then make their dives while the defenders were occupied. But Henderson knew that no torpedo bombers were coming. The devastators from the Hornet had already been slaughtered almost to a man, their obsolete aircraft no match for the Japanese defenses. The Enterprise's torpedo squadron had fared no better. If he waited for coordination that was never going to happen, he would simply run out of fuel and ditch in the ocean. The alternative was to attack immediately, without fighter cover, without torpedo bomber support, diving straight into the teeth of the Japanese defenses. It was, by any rational calculation, suicide. Henderson keyed his radio. His voice was calm, almost conversational, as he gave the order that would define his legacy. "Gentlemen," he said, "we have found the enemy. We will attack now. Follow me down." Behind him, Ensign William Roberts, flying on Henderson's right wing, later recalled his immediate reaction to that order. "I thought the skipper had lost his mind," Roberts would write in a letter home that he sent 3 weeks later. "We had no cover, no support, and those carriers had more fighters than I had ever seen in one place." But there was something in his voice, this absolute certainty that made me follow him anyway. I think we all felt that if anyone could pull this off, it was Henderson. The standard attack profile for a dive bomber called for an approach at 15,000 feet, a dive angle of approximately 70 degrees, bomb release at 2,000 feet, and a pullout at no lower than 1,000 feet to avoid the blast of your own weapon. These parameters had been developed through years of testing and training, refined to maximize accuracy while giving the pilot a reasonable chance of survival. Henderson ignored all of them. Instead of climbing to 15,000 feet, he pushed his Dauntless into a dive from 6,000 feet, an altitude so low that the Japanese anti-aircraft gunners could track him visually without difficulty. Instead of a 70-degree dive angle, he went nearly vertical, pointing his aircraft's nose directly at the deck of the nearest carrier like a falcon stooping on its prey. And instead of releasing at 2,000 feet, Henderson held his bomb until he was below 1,000 feet, so close to the target that Kowalski in the rear seat could see the expressions on the faces of the Japanese sailors looking up at them. The physics of what Henderson was attempting were terrifying. At that speed and altitude, the margin for error was measured in fractions of a second. Pull out too late, and the aircraft would impact the water or the carrier deck before the pilot could recover. Pull out too early and the bomb would miss, wasting the one chance they had to hurt the enemy. The G-forces involved in such a maneuver were at the very edge of what the human body could endure, enough to cause blackouts, hemorrhaging, even death. Kowalski would later describe those seconds as the longest of his life. The world had narrowed to the carrier deck rushing up toward them, the scream of the engine, and the impossible conviction that they were about to be destroyed. He had stopped firing his rear gun, unable to do anything but grip the edge of his cockpit and pray. Henderson released his bomb at 800 feet, then hauled back on the stick with all his strength. The Dauntless groaned, its aluminum frame protesting the forces being applied to it, rivets straining, control surfaces shuddering on the edge of failure. For a long moment, Kowalski was certain they were going to crash. Then, impossibly, the nose came up, the water rushing past so close beneath them that Kowalski could feel the spray on his face. Behind them, the 1,000-pound bomb struck the cargo just forward of the bridge, penetrating the flight deck and detonating among the armed and fueled aircraft that were being prepared for launch. The explosion was catastrophic. Aviation fuel ignited, spreading fire across the hangar deck. Bombs and torpedoes cooked off in a chain reaction of secondary explosions that turned the ship into an inferno. Within minutes, the cargo was ablaze from bow to stern, her crew abandoning their stations as the fires spread beyond any hope of control. But Henderson was not done. As he pulled out of his dive, skimming across the waves at barely 50 feet of altitude, Henderson could see the other carriers maneuvering desperately to avoid the fate of the cargo. The Akagi was turning hard to port, her deck crew scrambling to clear the aircraft that had been caught by the attack. Without hesitation, Henderson hauled his Dauntless around in a turn so tight that Kowalski felt his vision graying at the edges from the G-forces. "We are going in again," Henderson announced over the radio, his voice still unnervingly calm. "Anyone with ordnance left? Follow me." Only 3 other aircraft had survived the initial dive and still had bombs to drop. Lieutenant James Morrison, Ensign Roberts, and Ensign Patricia, known by his squadron mates as Pete, formed up behind Henderson as he climbed back to attack altitude. The Japanese fighters, caught off guard by the speed and ferocity of the initial attack, were still regrouping. For a few precious seconds, the path to the remaining carriers was almost clear. Morrison would later describe what happened next as the most extraordinary display of airmanship he had ever witnessed. Henderson did not simply repeat his previous attack. Instead, he seemed to improvise in real time, adjusting his approach, his angle, his timing based on what the Japanese were doing below. When anti-aircraft fire concentrated on his approach vector, he jinked to throw off their aim. When fighters moved to intercept, he used cloud cover and the smoke from the burning cargo to mask his movements. The Akagi was his second target. Henderson dove on her from the northeast, coming out of the sun so that the anti-aircraft gunners had to squint into the glare to track him. His bomb struck aft of amidships, penetrating the flight deck and detonating in the upper hangar. Like the Kaga, the Akagi was caught with armed and fueled aircraft on deck. The results were equally devastating. Fire spread through the ship with terrifying speed, fed by the aviation gasoline that was stored throughout the vessel. Admiral Nagumo, who had been directing the defense from the Akagi's bridge, was forced to evacuate the flagship as flames approached his position. He transferred his flag to a cruiser, but by then effective command of the carrier strike force had effectively ceased to exist. 2 carriers were dying, and the attack was still ongoing. Henderson, incredibly, had one more target in his sights. By this point, his Dauntless had taken multiple hits from anti-aircraft fire. The engine was running rough, oil pressure dropping, the aircraft leaving a thin trail of smoke as it climbed for the 3rd attack. Kowalski had been wounded in the arm by a shell fragment, though he would not realize the severity of his injury until after they landed. The rational thing to do, the sensible thing, would have been to break off and try to make it back to the Enterprise while they still could. Henderson refused to consider it. The Soryu was turning away from the burning wrecks of her sister ships, her captain hoping to escape the chaos and launch a counterattack against the American carriers. Henderson calculated the intercept angle in his head, pushed his damaged engine to full power, and began his 3rd dive of the morning. This time the Japanese were ready for him. Every anti-aircraft gun that could bear was trained on the lone American aircraft plunging toward the Soryu, tracers converging on Henderson's Dauntless from all directions. The sky around him seemed to be filled with explosions, the concussion battering the aircraft, punching holes in the wings and fuselage. A shell struck the engine cowling, sending fragments into the cockpit. Henderson felt a sharp pain in his left leg, looked down to see blood soaking through his flight suit. The instruments in front of him were going haywire, gauges spinning uselessly, warning lights flickering on and off. The aircraft was dying around him, but it was still flying, still diving, still on target. He released his bomb at 600 feet, the lowest release altitude recorded in the entire Pacific conflict. The weapon struck the Soryu just forward of her island superstructure, penetrating deep into the ship before detonating. The explosion was followed immediately by the detonation of the bombs and torpedoes stored in the hangar, a chain reaction that effectively gutted the carrier from within. The pullout from this dive was even more harrowing than the previous 2. Henderson's controls were sluggish, the aircraft responding to his inputs with a terrifying delay. For several seconds, he was convinced they were going to crash into the ocean, but somehow, through skill or luck or sheer stubborn refusal to accept the impossible, he managed to level off just feet above the waves, the Dauntless staggering through the air like a wounded bird. Behind him, 3 Japanese carriers were ablaze. The Kaga, the Akagi, and the Soryu would all sink before the day was over, their fires burning uncontrolled until the hulls could no longer support the weight of their superstructures. Hundreds of aircraft, the cream of Japanese naval aviation, were being consumed by flames. Thousands of highly trained sailors and aircrew, irreplaceable assets that Japan could never fully replace, were fighting for their lives amid the infernos. In the span of perhaps 15 minutes, Henderson had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Pacific. The 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, would survive long enough to launch a counterattack that damaged the Yorktown, but she too would be found and destroyed later that afternoon by aircraft from the Enterprise. By sunset on June 4, 1942, the Japanese carrier strike force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months had been completely eliminated. The expansion of the Japanese Empire had reached its high water mark and would begin an irreversible retreat that would end only with the conclusion of the conflict 3 years later. Henderson's journey back to the Enterprise was an ordeal in itself. His aircraft was barely flyable, leaking fuel and oil, its controls responding only partially to his inputs. Kowalski, despite his wound, had to help Henderson stay conscious during the long flight, talking to him constantly, keeping him focused on the task of getting them home. Several times the engine sputtered and nearly died, forcing Henderson to make adjustments that only his years of experience could have guided. When they finally spotted the Enterprise, Henderson was operating on pure willpower. His vision was narrowing, his hands shaking from blood loss and exhaustion. The landing was rough, the Dauntless catching the third wire and slamming down on the deck with a force that would have been considered unacceptable in training. But they were down. They were alive. The flight deck crew who pulled Henderson from his cockpit were shocked by what they found. His flight suit was soaked with blood, his face pale as paper. He had taken fragments in both legs and his left arm, injuries that would have incapacitated most men. Yet he had managed to fly for over an hour, maintain control of a critically damaged aircraft, and deliver a bomb on target under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The squadron medical officer, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, would later write in her report that Henderson's survival defied medical explanation. By all rights, she noted, he should have lost consciousness within minutes of sustaining those injuries. The only explanation I can offer is that his determination to complete his mission somehow overrode his body's normal physiological responses. I have never seen anything like it, and I doubt I ever will again. Word of Henderson's achievement spread through the fleet within hours. Sailors who had watched the attack through binoculars from the escort ships told stories of the lone Dauntless that had dived again and again into the inferno, each time emerging seemingly by miracle. Fighter pilots who had witnessed the attack from above described it as the most courageous thing they had ever seen. Even the ship's chaplain, Father Michael O'Brien, devoted his evening service to what he called a testament to the power of faith and courage in the darkest of circumstances. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the American Carrier Task Force, visited Henderson in sick bay that evening. The admiral was not known for displays of emotion, but witnesses reported that he was visibly moved as he thanked Henderson for his service. "What you did today," Spruance said, "will be remembered as long as men sail the seas and fly above them. You have given us a victory that will change the course of this conflict." Henderson's recovery was long and difficult. The injuries to his legs required multiple surgeries, and he would walk with a pronounced limp for the rest of his life. He was awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor that the Navy could bestow, along with a promotion to commander. But perhaps more meaningfully to Henderson himself, he received a letter from Admiral Yamamoto's chief of staff, intercepted by American intelligence, in which the Japanese officer admitted that the attack on June 4th had been the decisive moment when he realized that the conflict could not be won. The strategic implications of Henderson's attack extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their air groups represented a blow from which the Japanese Navy never recovered. The experienced pilots who perished in the fires of the Kaga, Akagi, Soryu and Hiryu could not be replaced by the Japanese training system, which had been optimized for quality over quantity. In contrast, American industrial capacity was just beginning to hit its stride, with new carriers and aircraft rolling off production lines in numbers that Japan could never hope to match. Within 18 months of the engagement at Midway, the United States would commission more fleet carriers than Japan had possessed at the start of the conflict. The tide of the Pacific conflict had turned, and it would never turn back. But for Henderson and the men who flew with him, the significance of that day was measured in more personal terms. They had faced impossible odds, made impossible decisions, and somehow survived. They had proven that courage and skill could still matter in a world increasingly dominated by industrial production and technological superiority. And they had demonstrated that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat comes down to one person's willingness to do what everyone else considers impossible. Ensign Roberts, who survived the engagement and went on to become a commercial pilot after the conflict ended, was interviewed about that day many times over the following decades. Each time he returned to the same theme: Henderson's calm in the face of certain destruction, his absolute conviction that they could succeed, even when every rational calculation said otherwise. "We all thought we were going to be lost that morning," Roberts said in a 1975 documentary about the engagement. "Every single one of us. The odds were just too long, the defenses too strong." But Henderson never wavered, not for a second. And because he believed we could do it, we believed it too. That is leadership. That is courage. That is what won the day. Kowalski, Henderson's radio man, remained in contact with his pilot for the rest of their lives. They exchanged letters, visited each other's families, and attended Squadron reunions together until Henderson passed away in 1987. At Henderson's funeral, Kowalski delivered a eulogy that captured the essence of the man he had served with on that impossible morning. Max Henderson was not a complicated man, Kowalski said, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. He believed in duty, in honor, in doing what was right, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. On June 4th, 1942, he showed all of us what those words really mean. He dove into fire 3 times when once would have been more than anyone could ask. He brought us home when our aircraft was falling apart around us. And he changed the course of history through nothing more than skill, courage, and an absolute refusal to accept that anything was impossible. I was proud to fly with him. I am proud to have known him, and I know that somewhere he is still flying, still leading the way for the rest of us to follow. The lessons of Henderson's attack at Midway have been studied at naval academies around the world for decades. Tacticians have analyzed his approach, debating whether his success was the result of genius or luck, calculated risk or reckless abandon. The consensus that has emerged is that it was probably all of these things, a perfect storm of skill, timing, courage, and fortune that came together in a single extraordinary moment. But perhaps the most important lesson is the simplest one. In the darkest moments, when all seems lost, when every rational calculation argues for retreat or surrender, there is still value in pressing forward. Henderson's attack succeeded not because the odds were in his favor, but because he refused to let the odds determine his actions. He saw what needed to be done, and he did it regardless of the cost. That willingness to act, to commit fully, even in the face of apparent impossibility, is what separates the decisive moments of history from the forgotten ones. It is what turns ordinary people into heroes and hopeless situations into turning points. And it is what Maxwell Henderson demonstrated on a June morning above the Pacific Ocean, when his squadron thought he was suicidal, and he proved them gloriously, magnificently wrong. The carriers that burned that day are long gone, their rusted hulls resting on the ocean floor miles beneath the surface. The men who fought and served on both sides have mostly passed into history, their stories preserved only in documents and memories. But the lesson of that morning endures, that courage, skill, and determination can still change the world, even when the world seems determined to prove otherwise. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.